when times get tough, when you look like situation is going to be a struggle, you really just have to have confidence in the plan, your vision, and in the team that you've built around you.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Executive. For those joining for the first time, this is a show where we interview some of the best founders, investors, and operators on their life lessons and advice on how to make it at the highest level. In past few shows, we've interviewed quite a few people in the aerospace industry, whether it's on the venture capital side or in private equity. Today, we're taking a switch to the pharmaceutical side with Seth Lederman, who is the CEO and co-founder of Tonix Pharmaceuticals, who have been publicly listed on the NASDAQ since 2013. So we're going to discuss how that's been as a CEO of a public company and how he's had to adapt, as well as they've had to deal with the adversity of ups and downs in the stock market. We're going to talk about their phase 3 trials and what that means for the company going forward, and just some of his career advice as a CEO for the last 10 plus years. So Seth, really appreciate you taking the time. Excited to hear about your story. And again, thanks for being on.
Thank you very much for having me on, Matt.
My pleasure. Well, we've got a lot to cover today. We got to talk about some phase 3 results, just exciting times for the company, talk about, you as a CEO as things have evolved, but let's go all the way back to the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your background and where it all started.
Well, thank you, Matt. I started my career as a young doctor at the start of the AIDS epidemic. And my first crusade was to work to develop drugs and vaccines against AIDS. And in that regard, I was a cellular immunologist and a molecular virologist, mostly working on the connection of CD4 and GP120, the entry of AIDS. But I trained in rheumatology and became very interested in fibromyalgia, which is one of the hallmark diseases of rheumatology. It was formerly known as rheumatism, which is really where rheumatology's name comes from. But I had a lot of tools at my disposal because of the great training I'd gotten. And I've been focused on rheumatology and fibromyalgia for some time after that.
And then in the early days, I think you had started Targent Pharmaceuticals, which eventually got acquired. That was your first company. Then obviously you founded Tonix Pharmaceuticals. Before going into Tonix Pharmaceuticals and what your team is building there, what were some of the lessons you took from Targent into Tonix? What were the big learnings for you as a first-time founder? Because before that, I think you were a professor, right, at university?
Yes, I was an associate professor at Columbia University in the Department of Medicine. But my real job at Columbia was to run an NIH-funded lab where we were doing basic research on immunology, molecular virology, and related topics. So my first company was actually a company that became known as Vela, VELA Pharmaceuticals. And one of the things we were working on at Vela was a treatment for fibromyalgia. But my second company, as you mentioned, was Targent. And in Targent, we were focused on developing a better treatment for colorectal cancer. It's a very common form of cancer. And we were successful. And that drug was ultimately sold with Targent to Spectrum Pharmaceuticals. And it was approved. The generic name is levofulinic acid. And it's today, as a generic, one of the most widely used medicines in colorectal cancer.
Amazing. So you took obviously it's a huge success to have anything FDA approved, which is hopefully the goal of Tonix. What were you, as you take some of those winnings into Tonix, what were the things, and you started Tonix quite a few years ago, but what were those things that you really took into Tonix of how to make sure this drug is successful?
Well, we had a lot of medical success at Targent, and I believe we've helped a lot of people. But in a downturn in the, call it the private or the venture capital backed markets after the 2000 crash, I guess you would call it the tech crash, I learned that public companies have more staying power through bad times. So, one of the important lessons from Tonix, from Targent, was that early on we wanted to make Tonix a public company so that we could withstand the ups and downs of the private capital raising markets, and we could steward drugs further through the development and also bring us and our investors the rewards of getting drugs.
Why do you think public companies have more staying power in your world than a private company?
Well, some people use the term for public companies permanent capital, meaning that you have a shareholder base and you have investment capital. But there are many more ways to raise money for public companies and many more investors who are attracted by the liquidity of public companies relative to private companies that are venture backed, where you're really at the vicissitudes of the private markets and the particular venture capitalists who are backing you. So I think that public companies, given the long road it takes to get a drug developed, public companies seem to be a better vehicle for sustaining the ups and downs of the markets to steward drugs along through the approval process.
And we'll get into, you're doing a new offering, and I definitely want to touch on that. But let's take a quick step back on Tonix Pharmaceuticals. What is your team focused on? And tell us about all the exciting things too going on with the phase 3 trials.
Thank you. Right now, we're focused on filing the new drug application for our product called Tonmya, which is a new trade name that was conditionally approved by the FDA. It used to be known as TNX 102SL, and this is an every night bedtime therapy for fibromyalgia. We now have
And
two.
and Seth, sorry to interrupt, but taking one step back, can you explain fibromyalgia and what that disease does?
Sure. Fibromyalgia is known as a chronic pain condition because pain is the most prominent syndrome of fibromyalgia. But fibromyalgia is really a syndrome composed of four main symptoms. So, one of the symptoms is pain, another one is sleep problems, third one, fatigue, and finally, brain fog. But each one of those is pretty distinctive for fibromyalgia. The kind of pain they get is called widespread pain because it affects all of the body. The kind of sleep problem they have is called non restorative sleep because they wake up not feeling refreshed. They don't get the benefit of sleep, even if they may appear to be asleep. Fatigue has a pretty common meaning, which is essentially low energy. And then finally, the brain fog is a particular kind of cognitive issue where they have trouble multitasking and some memory issues, but they're all pretty distinctive. But those four symptoms in one combination or another really typify fibromyalgia.
People take sleeping pills, but sleeping pills aren't restorative, right? Because they don't get you into deep sleep. They just get you, it affects the amount of sleep you have, but it's not the quality of sleep. And it sounds like your drug is actually impacting the quality of sleep.
That's exactly right. It really matters which type of medicine is used to treat the sleep issue in fibromyalgia. And you're also correct that the Ambien, a very widely used, called a non-benzo class drug, was tried in fibromyalgia, and that did not help with the issues of fibromyalgia. There was one drug that's a sleep drug that did benefit fibromyalgia patients, and that was called Xyrem from Jazz Pharmaceuticals. And that provided a benefit, but the company did not decide to advance it to FDA approval because it had other issues, and they felt it was better suited to market that just for patients with catalepsy and narcolepsy, which is more of an orphan indication. But it was an important uh, piece of information for us in terms of recognizing that improved sleep could be the key to unraveling fibromyalgia.
And I didn't realize how many people had it. That it affects roughly 6 to 12 million Americans. Is that right? That have fibromyalgia?
Yes, there's a lot of back and forth on what the real numbers are, but I think that 6 to 12 million Americans is commonly used, or sometimes people say 10 million Americans. But the only comprehensive prevalence study in the United States was done by Professor Vincent, and that actually came with a prevalence of 6.4%, which would be, you know, essentially more like 20 million patients.
Wow.
So I think it's hard to figure out exactly what the prevalence of fibromyalgia is, but I think we know enough to know that it is common.
And they also don't know the cause, correct?
Well, we do know the cause, but there's not one cause. The it commonly occurs or is diagnosed after someone recovers from an illness, for example, a viral illness. But it can also occur in the aftermath of trauma, for example, a motor vehicle collision, or from uh, toxins. For example, uh, it's not uncommon for fibromyalgia to be diagnosed in women with breast cancer after chemotherapy for breast cancer. So I think it's fair to say that fibromyalgia happens as a result of some kind of stress. It has to be a pretty significant stress, but it can be a stress of infectious origin, trauma, or, as I said, a chemical toxin.
And what's your drug doing to address that now? And can you talk about where you're at in the process of solving for that?
Yeah, so our drug is an every night bedtime medicine, and it's designed to improve the quality of sleep, not the quantity of sleep. Our drug is based on the active ingredient called cyclobenzaprine, which is a tricyclic molecule. And cyclobenzaprine had been approved as an oral swallowed pill by Merck many years ago and branded as Flexeril. But that was really designed to have stable blood levels over the course of a day, or even, over the course of several days. Whereas what we've designed our drug to be is to provide rapid increases in blood levels upon taking it, and then to have the blood levels go down in the morning when someone is waking up. So we've designed a sublingual, an under the tablet, with a dynamic profile of blood levels, which is quite different from the Merck product. And where we are is that we've now have two positive phase 3 studies, so we are preparing to file the new drug application. And we've guided that we will file the new drug application with FDA to obtain FDA approval in the second half of this year, 2024.
That's amazing. And for those people who don't know, there's typically three phases of drug trials, the third being with humans. And now that you've passed all three trials, hopefully, fingers crossed, the FDA should approve that since the results look very positive. Is that right?
Yes, I'm optimistic. I think that, we have conducted two full trials, which is the standard for FDA approval. And we have clear efficacy signals on pain, which is the primary endpoint, and a lot of activity on secondary endpoints. And in our studies, the drug has been well tolerated. So safety is a very important consideration for FDA. And we really didn't see unexpected safety signals. So I'm pretty confident that we have an approvable package.
I mean, that's really exciting, again, especially considering, I mean, this is such a painful disease that people have to live with, the amount of pain that they endure during the day. So if this can alleviate that for 6% of Americans, what a big deal that could be. With that, we talked a little bit about you're saying that sometimes it's more maybe sustainable to be a public company in your world. And so you've been on the NASDAQ since 2013. You're doing another offering of about 30 million, which could turn into, I believe, another $144 million with future warrants. Can you talk about why are you doing that? Why are you doing that now? Why raise additional capital today?
Well, we were pleased to raise that money and to bring in new institutional investors into our company. To be a public company developing drugs, it's very important to have institutional investors. So we're very pleased with that transaction in December. that we conducted pretty much simultaneously with announcing the data, the results of this positive phase 3 study. We are very pleased that it gave us, runway and also mechanisms to get additional capital to bring the drug to the FDA and beyond.
And then the additional, where you get to about $144 million of additional capital, are those essentially options for those institutional investors that they can take depending on certain key metrics that happen down the road?
Yes, well, they're formally called warrants, and a contract where the investor, at their option, can exercise the warrant. But when they exercise the warrant, Tonix gets cash for the warrant. So there were two tiers of warrants in that transaction. One tier of warrant is exercised at cents, and another tier of warrants is exercised at 85 cents. So presumably the investors will be motivated to exercise those warrants if our stock goes, above 55 and a half cents or above 85 cents, because then that would be a transaction for them that would be, that they would be profitable.
And you've been through quite a bit of, you've been through a lot of ups and downs over the last 10 years or 11 years now of being a public company. How have you dealt with that as a CEO and helped your team when the stock does go down pretty significantly and there's a lot of pressure on you as a leader? How have you dealt with that adversity?
It is challenging to be the head of a public company because sometimes the stock moves in ways that, for example, the company doesn't feel as reflective of our value. And it's just part of life. So we just have to go out every day and make progress in developing our drugs and tell the story as best as we can to as many people as possible, and expect and hope that we will get rewarded for the value that we bring to patients in the medical field, et cetera. So it is challenging though, but I think most of the people in the company are motivated by our mission. So the ups and downs of the stock market are in the background for most of us.
So you're able to really keep your team for what matters most, the today and not the today's stock price. You're on the future vision of helping, again, potentially 12, 20 million people in the US. How do you do that? How do you keep them when, unfortunately, public market, it's disappointing, but it all kind of sometimes feels like it's the one KPI stock price. How do you ensure that that doesn't distract them from the good work your team is doing and what your vision is?
Well, we have a remarkable team, and I think the foundation of any company, and we all are united behind the mission of the company. And I think it goes from a corporate culture. Corporate culture is very important, where we have a lot of communication within the team. By the time we make a decision, everyone seems to be on board with it. Although we encourage lively debate in terms of making decisions. But in the end of the day, people who work in biotech generally and people who work at Tonix specifically are very mission driven. And we have chosen a task that's difficult. Fibromyalgia is an extremely difficult condition to try to treat. And we have succeeded, I believe, in eliminating the clinical development risk for our program now that we have the two positive phase 3 studies. But it has been a long and expensive journey, and it has tested many of us individually and as a team. But I'm pleased to say that we're all sharing in the success of the clinical trials and are all about the next steps now that we really see filing the NDA as our next objective.
Yeah, I'm sure it feels like you're very close. One of the things that I got from what you had just said is it seems like you've done a good job recruiting people that are vision focused, and that's how you built that team. So when you do go through these kind of speed bumps, the first sign of trouble, people don't leave. It's because you've already made sure to hire the right people up front. That's what I really heard from that. I do. So when you actually, you file, let's say the FDA gives approval, what's next for the company? What happens next year?
Well, we are planning to launch the product ourselves, which is more often the case than outlicensing it for drugs that affect brain conditions. So there are a number of companies in the past 5 or 6 years who have gotten approval for central nervous system drugs who have gone out and launched them successfully. So sometimes after a company launches a drug and markets it successfully, then that could be a time when a big pharma might come in. For example, Biohaven developed the migraine headache treatment Nurtec, and Nurtec was approved in 2020, and in 2022, Pfizer bought Nurtec for about $12 billion. But I think that trend shows that Biohaven had to market Nurtec on their own for a couple of years, really to show that there was a good commercial potential. So we're prepared to do that for Tonmya to show the commercial potential.
And why do it yourself and rather maybe than outsourcing?
Well, doing it ourselves will be a combination of outsourcing certain functions, but doing some things by ourselves. As I said, if you look back over the companies that have recently gotten CNS drugs approved on their own, it's more often the case that they market them on their own. So, for example, Soam is marketing their product Auxility. Intracellular Therapeutics is marketing Caplita, and I could go on for a number of other products. So I think that there's no one that knows the product better than us.
Yeah.
And in terms of crafting the marketing messages and planning about how to make an impactful launch, it's hard to transfer all of that knowledge and passion, frankly, to another company. Nonetheless, there are cases where a big company will come in even before approval, as was seen with Bristol Myers Squibb recently buying Karuna to get a schizophrenia drug. So it does happen that sometimes business development or mergers acquisition will come in, but I don't think that M&A is a business strategy. I think it's nice when it happens, and we have to plan to do all the things that we can do that are under our control.
Yeah, and I mean you've worked on this for 10 plus years. It'd be hard to hand the ball off to right on the goal line to finish it for you through and make sure it's successful. I want to talk a little bit about your role as CEO, and you're also chairman of the board. What is your biggest focus on? Like, where are your priorities as the CEO right now?
Well, the board and the company for a relatively small company are pretty intertwined. So I think that being between the board and the company, I'm communicating things from the company to the board and things from the board to the company. But all in, I mean, my role is pretty focused on advancing the company in every way I can. It starts with providing vision, strategy, tactics, and managing the company so that all the parts work together and get to final results. And it's very satisfying to have a result like our December 2023 positive trial in fibromyalgia, because that's an extraordinarily complex trial to run. And it's very hard to lead a study like that to a positive endpoint. I mean, there were 33 sites all over the United States, 457 patients enrolled, and each patient is enrolled for 14 weeks. So all in all, a very significant logistical, scientific enterprise. And I'm delighted that we were able to make it all happen.
Yeah, I'm sure you're ready to exhale, but you're keeping your fingers crossed. What about you've been at, like you said, this is not your first company. You founded it now. I guess this would make this three. Been the CEO of them. What has been your biggest learning as a CEO?
Well, I think you need persistence because not everything works out the way you hope. Sometimes there are setbacks. And I think you have to believe in the mission, believe in the products, and believe in the team. And, I think that's probably the most important thing a CEO can do is to hold it together and make sure that a product that has merit gets its chance to succeed. Because particularly in the area of brain conditions, Very good drugs can miss a trial or two, but if the drug has merit, then it's important to see it through to the end, because then you're validating the risk and the hypothesis of investors and patients who participate in trials and the whole enterprise. So very satisfying to be on the cusp of a drug approval.
What about? I'm sure there's been things that have not been easy. We talked about a couple of those, but maybe something that surprised you about being an entrepreneur before you start. You would have been surprised by when you first started out.
Well, I think the hard thing is some of the big challenges that come on, and it's just hard to describe what it's like to be in these very challenging moments. And for example, our hardest uh, moment for our company was July of 2021, when we were halfway through a confirmatory phase 3 trial of a drug that had already succeeded in one trial. And we were very confident about the second trial. And at the interim analysis, we learned that the study wasn't going how we had hoped, and we had to stop enrollment and face the prospect of a missed study. And it was very challenging because investors lost confidence in the program. And it was a very challenging time in the markets and in the country, because we had been enrolling through the peak of the Delta wave of the COVID pandemic. And in retrospect, we now have a very good sense that it was really the Delta wave of the COVID pandemic that confounded certain aspects of that study. Fortunately, we were able to dust ourselves off, start the third study, which was ultimately positive, and which is our second phase 3 study that we're taking to the FDA. But it's easy to talk about hard times in a company, but living through them is very challenging, and keeping everything together and believing in the team and the products is the most important way to get out of it.
Were there certain tactics that you ensure you got through those hard times personally?
Well, I think the important thing is the team, trusting in the team, communicating with the team, and working with them to uh, get through these times. So I think, as I said before, the foundation of any company is the team, the human capital, if you will, though that's kind of a oxymoron. But it's really, these things don't happen from one person or even by a small group of people. It's really a large enterprise to see through the approval of, or the testing and approval of a pharmaceutical product.
Yeah. What as we start to wrap, I want to touch on if so I guess maybe some best advice you've ever received in your career. But before doing that, what would you say is the ultimate vision for Tonix Pharmaceuticals? What would, at the end of the day, if everything went right, where are you hoping Tonix goes?
Well, thanks. We're right at a turning point now, where we're going from being a development company to a commercial company. So that is a big transformation for Tonix, because we have a lot of expertise in developing drugs, testing them in clinical trials, and we have less expertise as a commercial company. Now, we did get ahead of that to some extent. In June of 2023, we acquired two products, commercial stage products. They are both treatments for acute migraine headache. One is called Zembrace, and the other is called Tosymra. And with that, we are building a commercial team to manage those products, but also to plan for and execute the launch of Tonmya, the fibromyalgia drug, since we expect that will have an FDA decision in the middle of 2025. So that is a big transformation for us. So my goal and my vision for the company is to see it through, that we become a commercial pharmaceutical company, marketing the product that we developed internally, along with the other products we recently bought. But when we accomplish that, hopefully we can think of other ways that we can bring value to investors and to patients.
Super exciting. Well, as we focus in back on you just for a bit, what would you say? I'm sure through some of the hard times and the good times, but I'm sure you've gotten a lot of advice. Has there been one piece of advice that's really stuck out to you that you look back on and say that was probably the best piece of advice I got in my career?
Well, I've gotten a lot of great advice in my career, and I'm grateful to my mentors and people who've supported me, and a host of people who've been responsible for my success. But a comment that was made to me, but in the when the stakes were looking rough for the Kansas City Chiefs one year, I read Coach Andy said to quarterback Patrick Mahomes, "Trust your eyes." And I think that that's really good advice. That in when times get tough, when you look like situation is going to be a struggle, you really just have to have confidence in the plan, your vision, and in the team that you've built around you.
It's a great reminder. What about, do you have a favorite book that's helped you in your career?
One of the people I admire the most is Edward Jenner, who discovered vaccination and really changed mankind, because at that time smallpox was a real scourge. And he wrote a book. It's a short book. It's called The Inquiry. It's a much longer title, but it's one of the most famous books in medical history. Most people refer to it as just The Inquiry. And I like it because Jenner has such a keen eye as a medical doctor and as a scientific investigator, that he was able to uh, understand how a virus that he used the word virus for the first time could cause a disease and could also be a vaccine, and he created the word vaccine. So his ability to interpret a very complicated situation and to imagine a microscopic world, and to name microscopic world and intuit mechanisms and things like that has just always struck me. He is really one of the, in my mind, one of the greatest scientists who's ever lived, that he was able to things. The other thing that's remarkable about Jenner that is almost a sequel to the inquiry was how he essentially created a pharmaceutical company around his vaccine efforts, and he disseminating the vaccine technology, spreading it around the world, and teaching people how to practice it correctly and interpret the results. So the inquiry is really a very remarkable book.
Yeah, great recommendation. All right, as we wrap up, what was there one piece of advice that you would leave, and it could be for aspiring CEOs, for founders. What would be one piece of career advice you would leave the audience with?
Well, the one piece of advice I would say is to work on important topics, because particularly in biotech, a project may take 10 years. And that's the case for our fibromyalgia treatment. We've been at it for more than 12 years. That if fibromyalgia was not such an important problem, and if we didn't think that our program could add to it, then we would not have stuck with it. So I think in the very beginning, it's important to choose important problems and to apply to them technology that you think can really be transformative. And we believe that with the treatment that we're developing for fibromyalgia, we'll not only have the possibility of bringing important medicine to fibromyalgia patients and hopefully alleviating suffering and other things, but we're also helping to understand fibromyalgia, to dissect it, to show the important role of unrefreshing sleep in the causation, chronicity, persistence, and relapse of fibromyalgia. So this has been a very rewarding scientific journey. And I think if we weren't, myself and the rest of the team, infused with the passion about what we are doing, we could not have survived the tough times.
Yeah, and then if you're going to work on something for 10 plus years, it should matter, right? Otherwise, why spend so much time on something that doesn't matter? So I think that's a good point on a couple different items, right? The importance got you through the heart of the importance of what you were working on, but also at the end of 10 years, you have something to show for that really matters and could impact a ton of people. So really, really excited for you and your team at Tonix. We got our fingers crossed over here. Really wishing you the best with the FDA approval and everything going forward. And Seth, really appreciate you taking the time to share a little bit about your story and what's going, what the path forward is for Tonix.
Thank you very much, Matt, for having me on.
Thanks, Seth. Take care.